You've been lied to about California. Every story you've heard about the Golden State starts with sunshine, opportunity, and the promise of a better life. The gold rush, the movie stars, the beaches, the American dream wrapped in palm trees and endless summer. But before California became a destination, it was a death sentence. You need to understand something. The people who came to early California didn't find paradise. They found a brutal, unforgiving wasteland that killed without warning and showed no mercy to the unprepared. This wasn't about chasing dreams. This was about clawing your way through each day and praying you'd see another sunrise. The history books skip over the parts that matter. They don't tell you about the miners who died face down in freezing rivers, their bodies left to rot because no one had time to bury them. They don't mention the families who starved to death 20 miles from a town because the journey was too dangerous to risk. They don't talk about the women who sold themselves just to afford a loaf of bread, or the children who worked 16-hour days in conditions that would make you sick to imagine. Early California wasn't built by dreamers. It was built by survivors. And most of them didn't make it. This isn't a feel-good story about pioneering spirit or manifest destiny. This is the truth about what it actually took to exist in a place that wanted you dead. You're going to see exactly what daily life looked like when there were no safety nets, no laws that mattered, and no guarantee you'd survive the week. By the end of this, you'll understand why early California wasn't the gold rush fantasy you learned about in school. It was a meat grinder that consumed human lives by the thousands, and the people who survived did so by sheer, desperate luck. Let me show you what they never taught you. Let's set the scene. We're talking about California from roughly 1848 to 1880, the gold rush era and the decades immediately following it. When you think of California in 1850, erase every image of modern Los Angeles or San Francisco from your mind. There were no cities, not real ones. What passed for towns were collections of tents and hastily built wooden shacks that could blow away in a strong wind. San Francisco, which today houses nearly 1 million people, was a muddy disaster of a settlement with maybe 25,000 desperate souls living in conditions you wouldn't force on animals. The landscape itself was an enemy. Northern California was dense, dark forest and steep mountain ranges that trapped snow and cold. The Sierra Nevada wasn't a beautiful backdrop for vacation photos. It was a wall that killed people. Every winter, entire groups of travelers got caught in mountain passes and froze to death or resorted to eating their dead to survive. The Donner Party wasn't an isolated tragedy. It was what happened when you underestimated these mountains. Central California was scorching, drought-prone valley land where summer temperatures regularly hit 110 degrees. There was no air conditioning, no ice, no relief. People died of heat stroke while working in fields, their bodies left where they fell because moving them wasn't worth the effort. Southern California was arid desert punctuated by occasional settlements that barely qualified as functional. Water was scarce. Shade was scarce. Everything that could kill you, rattlesnakes, scorpions, bandits, was abundant. And throughout all of it, there was virtually no infrastructure. No roads, just dirt paths that turned into impassable mud during rain. No bridges over rivers, meaning you either forded the current and risked drowning or you waited, sometimes for weeks, until the water level dropped. No supply chains, so if a town ran out of food, people just starved until the next wagon train arrived. If it arrived, communication was nearly impossible. If you traveled 100 miles from your starting point, you were effectively cut off from the rest of civilization. No phones, no telegraph lines in most areas until the 1860s. If something went wrong, if you got injured or robbed or lost, you were on your own. No one was coming to help you. The Native American population, which had lived sustainably on this land for thousands of years, was being systematically destroyed during this period. Disease brought by settlers wiped out entire villages. Violence from miners and militias killed thousands more. The survivors were displaced, starved, and often hunted for sport. This wasn't colonization, it was extermination. Meanwhile, waves of people kept coming. After gold was discovered in 1848, roughly 300,000 people flooded into California over the next decade. They came from the eastern United States, from Mexico, from China, from South America, from Europe. They came with nothing, expecting to strike it rich. Almost none of them did. What they found instead was a lawless territory where violence was routine, disease was everywhere, and survival required a level of hardship most of them had never imagined. California wasn't opportunity. It was a gamble, and the house always won. Let's talk about what it actually meant to live in early California. Forget comfort, forget safety, forget anything resembling a normal life. Your home wasn't a home. If you were a miner, and chances were high that you lived in a tent or a lean-to made from canvas and scrap wood. These structures provided almost no protection from the elements. When it rained, you got wet. When it was cold, you froze. When it was hot, you baked. If you were lucky enough to be in a town with actual buildings, you probably lived in a shared room with a dozen other men, sleeping on floors packed so tightly you could barely turn over. Privacy didn't exist. Neither did hygiene. Bathing was rare. Water had to be carried from rivers or wells, and if you were spending your days waist-deep in icy water panning for gold, you weren't eager to wash yourself when you got back to camp. Weeks would go by without a real bath. Clothes were worn until they literally rotted off bodies. The smell of a mining camp was overwhelming, a mix of human waste, rotting food, unwashed bodies, and smoke from campfires. Speaking of waste, there were no toilets. You went in the woods or behind a building or just in the street if you were in town. Human waste piled up in settlements, creating breeding grounds for disease. Rivers that people drank from were the same rivers people defecated in upstream. Contaminated water was a constant source of dysentery, cholera, and typhoid. Food was barely edible. If you were in a mining camp, your diet consisted of hardtack, salt pork, and beans. Hardtack was a dense, flavorless cracker that could break your teeth. Salt pork was preserved meat so saturated with salt that it burned your mouth. Beans were cooked over open fires and often came out half raw or burned. Fresh vegetables, fresh fruit, forget it. Scurvy was common because no one was getting vitamin C. Men's teeth fell out. Their gums bled constantly. They developed sores that wouldn't heal. If you were in a town, food was available for a price. And prices were insane. During the gold rush, a single egg could cost the equivalent of $1.25 in today's money. A pound of flour might cost $1.40. Coffee was liquid gold, traded and hoarded like currency. If you weren't finding gold, you couldn't afford to eat. And most people weren't finding gold. Starvation was real. People died of malnutrition regularly. Not just in remote camps, but in towns where food existed but was simply too expensive for the majority of residents. You could be surrounded by supply stores and still starve to death because you didn't have the money to buy anything. Weather was another killer. Winters in the mountains were brutal. Temperatures dropped below zero. Snow fell in feet, not inches, and lasted for months. Miners who stayed in the high country during winter, either because they were too stubborn to leave or couldn't afford to, often froze to death in their tents. Their bodies weren't found until spring thaw. Summers in the valleys were murderous. There was no escape from the heat. People worked through it anyway because stopping meant not eating. Heat stroke killed workers in the fields. Dehydration was constant. Water sources dried up, and people died of thirst within sight of dried riverbeds. Fire was a constant threat. Entire towns burned to the ground regularly because everything was made of wood and everyone used open flames for light and heat. San Francisco burned down 6 times between 1849 and 1851. 6 times. Each time people rebuilt in the same haphazard way, and each time it burned again. People lost everything repeatedly. You need to understand, there was no safety net, no insurance, no disaster relief. If your home burned down, you started over with nothing. If you got sick, you suffered alone. If you couldn't work, you didn't eat. Every single day was about survival, not success, not prosperity, survival. And for tens of thousands of people, even that wasn't enough. Let's be very clear about something. Almost everyone in early California was poor, not just struggling, not just living paycheck to paycheck, actually desperately, dangerously poor. The gold rush was sold as a path to wealth, but the reality was a lottery system where a handful of people won and everyone else lost. Badly. Mining wasn't a job, it was a slow death sentence. You worked 12 to 16 hours a day standing in freezing rivers, bent over at the waist, moving rocks and sifting through gravel looking for flakes of gold. The water was so cold it caused permanent nerve damage in your hands and feet. Your back was in constant agony from the bent position. Your hands bled from handling sharp rocks. Your legs went numb from standing in icy water for hours at a time. And for all that effort, most days you found nothing. Maybe you found a few flakes of gold dust worth a couple dollars. Maybe you found a tiny nugget worth $10 if you were lucky. But here's the thing. Everything in California was insanely expensive because there was no local production of goods. Everything had to be shipped in, and merchants charged whatever they wanted. A simple shovel cost the equivalent of $500 in today's money. A pickaxe was $600. Boots were $300 and lasted maybe 2 months before falling apart. You couldn't afford to replace them, so you worked barefoot, in freezing water, over sharp rocks. Room and board in a mining town cost about $20 a day in modern money. A meal at a restaurant, and by restaurant I mean a tent where someone served beans on a tin plate, was $15 to $20. A shot of whiskey was $10. Do the math. You're spending $50 to $70 a day on basic survival while pulling in maybe $5 to $10 a day in gold. You're going into debt just by existing. And that's if you were an independent miner. If you worked for a mining company, which became more common as the easy surface gold ran out, you made wages that were even worse. Mining companies paid workers maybe $3 a day and charged them for food, lodging, and tools. By the end of the week, most workers owed the company money. They were trapped in debt cycles they couldn't escape. The work was unbelievably dangerous. Mines collapsed regularly, burying workers alive. No one dug them out. Explosives misfired, blowing men apart. Chemical exposure from mercury used in gold processing caused brain damage and insanity. They called it Mad Hatter's disease, and it was everywhere in mining camps. If you weren't mining, your options weren't much better. Logging was another major industry, and it was even deadlier than mining. Loggers cut down massive redwood trees using hand saws and axes. Trees fell unpredictably, crushing workers. Ropes snapped, sending logs tumbling down hillsides and killing anyone in their path. Log jams in rivers drowned men who tried to break them up. Wages were low. Danger was constant. Agricultural work was backbreaking labor in extreme heat for almost no pay. Workers, many of them Chinese or Mexican immigrants, picked crops, dug irrigation ditches, and cleared land for less than $1 a day. There were no breaks, no shade, no water provided. You worked until you dropped, and if you dropped, you were replaced. Chinese laborers, who made up a huge portion of the workforce, were paid half what white workers earned for the same job. They lived in segregated camps with even worse conditions than white workers. They were blamed for taking jobs and were subjected to constant violence and discrimination. They built the railroads that connected California to the rest of the country, and they died by the thousands doing it. Explosives, avalanches, disease. Chinese workers were considered expendable. Women had almost no legitimate work options. Most women in early California were either prostitutes or worked in boarding houses under conditions that were barely better. If you were a woman who wanted to earn money, your choices were extremely limited and extremely dangerous. The wealth gap was staggering. A tiny percentage of people, the ones who got lucky in the early days of the gold rush, or the ones who owned supply stores and banks, became incredibly rich. Everyone else lived in grinding poverty. And here's the cruelest part. There was no way out. You couldn't save money because there was nothing left to save. You couldn't move somewhere else because you couldn't afford the journey. You were trapped, working yourself to death for nothing, watching your body break down while merchants and mine owners got rich off your suffering. This wasn't opportunity, it was exploitation. And it killed thousands of people who came to California believing the lies. In early California, death wasn't something that might happen. It was something that definitely would happen to someone you knew, probably soon, possibly to you. Disease was everywhere. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery, tuberculosis, scurvy, malaria, smallpox. These weren't rare illnesses. They were constant threats that ripped through mining camps and towns like wildfire. Cholera was especially horrifying. It killed fast, sometimes within hours of the first symptoms. You'd feel fine in the morning, have stomach cramps by noon, and be dead by sunset. Your body would dehydrate so rapidly that you'd die of shock. Entire camps would be wiped out in a week. Bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. Typhoid came from contaminated water, which was essentially all water in mining areas. The fever would spike so high you'd hallucinate. You'd waste away over weeks, unable to keep food down, losing weight until you looked like a skeleton. There was no treatment. You either survived or you didn't. Dysentery, bloody diarrhea caused by bacteria in filthy water, was so common it was just considered part of life. But it was deadly, especially combined with malnutrition. People died of dehydration and weakness, their bodies unable to absorb any nutrients. Tuberculosis spread easily in the crowded, poorly ventilated spaces where people lived. You'd cough blood for months, wasting away slowly while infecting everyone around you. It was a death sentence, just a slow one. Scurvy rotted people from the inside. Without vitamin C, your connective tissue breaks down. Old wounds reopen. Your gums bleed. Your teeth fall out. You bruise at the slightest touch. Eventually, you die from internal bleeding or infection. It was completely preventable with fresh fruits and vegetables, but most people in mining camps went months without either. There were no hospitals, not in any real sense. A mining camp might have someone who claimed to be a doctor, but they usually were. They were con artists with no medical training who charged desperate people for useless treatments. Actual doctors were rare and expensive. Most people couldn't afford them even if they were available. Medical treatment was primitive and often more dangerous than doing nothing. Surgery was performed without anesthesia or sterilization. Infections killed more people than the original injuries. Amputations were common. If you broke a leg badly, they just cut it off and hoped you didn't die of gangrene. Many did. Injuries were constant and often fatal. Mining accidents crushed bones and caused internal injuries that couldn't be treated. Infections from even minor cuts killed people regularly because there were no antibiotics. A small wound on your hand could turn septic, spread up your arm, and kill you within a week. Childbirth was a death sentence for many women. Without proper medical care, complications during labor killed mothers and babies regularly. Women died of hemorrhaging, infection, and exhaustion. Babies died during birth or within days afterward. Maternal mortality rates were astronomically high, and when people died, there wasn't much ceremony about it. Bodies were buried in shallow graves, often without coffins. Markers were just wooden crosses that rotted away within a year. Mass graves were common after disease outbreaks. In some camps, there were more people in the cemetery than there were living in the town. The average lifespan for someone living in a California mining camp in the 1850s was maybe 35 to 40 years. That's not an exaggeration. People aged rapidly under the conditions. A 30-year-old man would look 50. A 40-year-old would look ancient. Death was so common it stopped being shocking. People became numb to it. You'd wake up and find the man who slept next to you had died in the night, and you'd just drag his body out and get on with your day. There wasn't time to grieve. There was only time to survive. Early California was, quite simply, one of the most violent places in America during the 19th century. Law enforcement barely existed, and where it did exist, it was corrupt, overwhelmed, or both. Murder was common, not occasional, common. Arguments over mining claims ended in shootings. Disputes in saloons ended in stabbings. Robberies turned deadly without hesitation. In San Francisco during the 1850s, there were multiple murders every single day. Most were never investigated. Bodies were left in the streets until someone bothered to move them. Theft was constant. You couldn't trust anyone. Miners slept with their gold under their pillows or buried in the dirt floors of their tents, and it was still stolen regularly. Tools were stolen. Supplies were stolen. Even boots and clothing were stolen from camps while people slept. There was no police force in most mining towns, none. If you were robbed or assaulted, there was no one to report it to. You either handled it yourself or you accepted the loss. Vigilante justice was the only justice. And vigilante justice was brutal. Communities formed groups called vigilance committees that would capture suspected criminals and hold immediate trials. There was no due process, no lawyers, no real investigation. If the committee decided you were guilty, they hanged you, sometimes the same day you were accused. These weren't rare occurrences. In San Francisco alone, vigilance committees hanged dozens of people between 1851 and 1856. Some were probably guilty. Many probably were. It didn't matter. The violence was the point. It was meant to terrify people into compliance. Racial violence was horrific and constant. Chinese immigrants were attacked regularly. White mobs would raid Chinese camps, beating and killing residents and burning their homes. Native Americans were hunted and killed for sport. Mexican miners were driven off their claims at gunpoint. The state government even paid bounties for Native American scalps. Children's scalps were worth money. This was state-sanctioned genocide. Women were in constant danger. Prostitution was rampant because there were almost no women in early California, and the ones who were there had few options. Many were forced into prostitution, either by economic desperation or by actual force. They were beaten, robbed, and murdered regularly. No one investigated. No one cared. Claim jumping, stealing someone else's mining claim, was common and violent. If someone found a productive claim, others would simply take it by force. Shootouts over mining claims were daily events in gold country. Winners kept the claim. Losers were buried nearby if anyone bothered to bury them at all. Gangs operated openly. Groups of bandits like Joaquin Murrieta's gang, if he even existed, he might have been a myth, robbed stagecoaches, raided towns, and killed anyone who resisted. They were romanticized later as folk heroes, but the reality was they were violent criminals who terrorized entire regions. The justice system, where it existed, was a joke. Judges were appointed with no legal training. Trials were held in saloons. Sentences were arbitrary. If you had money, you could bribe your way out of almost anything. If you didn't, you were hanged for crimes you might not have committed. Prisons were rare and horrific. Most towns just chained prisoners to posts or threw them in holes in the ground. Punishments included public whipping, branding, and mutilation. California's first state prison, San Quentin, opened in 1852 and was immediately notorious for its violence and inhumane conditions. Prisoners died of disease, starvation, and beatings from guards. You need to understand, in early California, violence wasn't a breakdown of order. Violence was the order. It was how disputes were settled, how resources were controlled, how power was maintained. If you couldn't defend yourself, you lost everything. If you fought back and won, you survived another day. There was no safety, not anywhere, not for anyone. If life was brutal for white men in early California, it was catastrophically worse for everyone else. Women were rare in the early years of the gold rush. In 1850, women made up less than 10% of California's population. This created a society that was not just male-dominated but aggressively hostile to women. Most women who came to California came because their husbands dragged them there, or because they had no other options. Once they arrived, their choices were extremely limited. You could be married, which meant endless domestic labor in horrific conditions. You could work in a boarding house, which was also endless domestic labor plus the constant threat of sexual assault. Or you could become a prostitute, which was almost guaranteed sexual assault, disease, and early death. Prostitution was one of the only ways women could earn significant money, And even then, most of that money went to madams or brothel owners. Women worked in conditions that were brutal even by the standards of early California. Disease was rampant. Syphilis and gonorrhea were almost universal among sex workers, and there was no treatment. Beatings from clients were common. Murder was common. Most prostitutes died before age 30. Women had virtually no legal rights. They couldn't own property in most cases. They couldn't vote. They couldn't serve on juries. If they were assaulted or raped, there was almost no chance of justice. If they left abusive husbands, they had nowhere to go and no way to support themselves. Childbirth, as mentioned earlier, was incredibly dangerous. Women gave birth in tents, in wagons, in mining camps with no medical assistance. Many died. The babies who survived often died within months from disease or malnutrition. Large families were common, not because people wanted many children, but because so many children died that you needed to have many just to ensure some survived. Children in early California had no childhood, not in any sense we'd recognize. Child labor was universal and expected. Children as young as 5 or 6 worked in the fields. 7- and 8-year-olds worked in mines. 10-year-olds did the same labor as adults and were paid a fraction of adult wages if they were paid at all. There were no child labor laws, no compulsory education, no protections of any kind. Children were economic assets and they were worked until their bodies broke down. Injuries were common. Deaths were common. Orphans were everywhere. Disease and violence killed parents constantly, and there were no social services to care for the children left behind. Orphans begged in the streets, formed gangs, or were taken in by adults who used them as unpaid labor. Many didn't survive to adulthood. Chinese immigrants faced systematic discrimination and violence. Chinese workers were paid half what white workers earned for the same job. They were forced to live in segregated areas. They were blamed for every social problem and subjected to violent attacks. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was the culmination of decades of hatred, but the violence started much earlier. In 1871, a white mob in Los Angeles lynched 18 Chinese residents in what became known as the Chinese Massacre. It was one of the largest mass lynchings in American history. No one was punished. Chinese workers built the western half of the Transcontinental Railroad, and they died by the thousands doing it. They were given the most dangerous jobs, setting explosives, working on cliff faces, tunneling through mountains. When they died, they were replaced. Their deaths weren't even counted accurately. Mexican residents and Mexican immigrants, many of whom had lived in California before it became part of the United States, were driven from their land through violence and legal manipulation. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848 supposedly protected their property rights, but those protections were ignored. White settlers simply took land by force, and Mexican owners had no recourse. Mexican miners were routinely driven from productive claims at gunpoint. They faced constant discrimination and violence. Laws like the Foreign Miners Tax of 1850 specifically targeted Mexican and Chinese miners, forcing them to pay exorbitant fees that white miners didn't have to pay. Native Americans suffered the worst of all. What happened to California's native population during this period can only be described as genocide. The native population dropped from around 150,000 in 1848 to less than 30,000 by 1870. Disease, starvation, and systematic violence killed them by the tens of thousands. The state government funded militias that hunted Native Americans. Settlers were encouraged to kill Native people and take their land. Children were kidnapped and sold into indentured servitude. Villages were burned. People were massacred. This wasn't a byproduct of expansion. It was the goal. California's first governor, Peter Hardeman Burnett, openly called for the extermination of Native Americans, and that's essentially what happened. Every marginalized group in early California faced violence, exploitation, and death on a scale that's hard to comprehend. The Golden State was built on their suffering. If you had to pick the absolute worst time and place to be in early California, it would be the winter of 1849-1850 in the Sierra Nevada mining camps. The gold rush was in full swing. Tens of thousands of people had flooded into the territory over the summer and fall, and almost none of them were prepared for what winter in the mountains actually meant. Most miners stayed in the high country, refusing to abandon their claims even as snow began to fall in October. They de-invested everything to get there, sold their homes, left their families, spent months traveling across the country or sailing around South America. They couldn't afford to leave empty-handed, so they stayed, and winter came. The snow started early and didn't stop. By November, mining camps were buried under feet of snow. By December, it was worse. By January, people were trapped in tents and lean-tos with no heat source beyond small campfires that couldn't keep the cold out. Temperatures dropped below zero and stayed there for weeks. Food supplies ran out. The trails were impassable, so no supply wagons could get through. Camps that had relied on weekly deliveries were suddenly cut off completely. Stored food ran out by mid-December. By January, people were starving. Some tried to leave to make the journey down to the valleys where towns had food. Almost none of them made it. The snow was too deep. The cold was too severe. Bodies were found frozen on the trails, half buried in snow, sometimes sitting upright as if they just stopped to rest and never got up again. The ones who stayed in camp didn't fare much better. Starvation set in. People ate their leather boots. They ate bark. They ate anything remotely digestible. Some resorted to cannibalism. This wasn't limited to the Donner Party. It happened in multiple camps that winter. People don't talk about it because it's too horrifying, but it happened. Disease spread rapidly in the crowded, filthy conditions. Typhus, pneumonia, frostbite that turned gangrenous. People died in their tents and their bodies were left there because the ground was frozen too hard to dig graves. Corpses piled up, sometimes frozen solid, sometimes partially eaten by starving survivors. Men went insane from the isolation, the hunger, and the cold. There are accounts of men wandering out into snowstorms, naked, raving, and never being seen again. Others turned violent, killing over scraps of food. When spring came and the snow finally melted, rescue parties found the camps. What they described was like something out of a nightmare. Bodies everywhere. Survivors skeletal and barely alive. The stench of death so strong it could be smelled from miles away. Estimates suggest that as many as 20% of the miners who stayed in the high country during the winter of 1849-1850 died. Thousands of people. Most of them died slowly, over weeks, from starvation and cold. And here's the worst part. It happened again the next winter, and the winter after that. Because people kept coming and they kept believing they'd be the exception, that they'd strike it rich and get out before winter hit. Most of them were wrong. That period, those first winters of the gold rush, represents the absolute peak of suffering in early California. It's when the gap between the promise and the reality was widest. It's when the most people died in the most horrible ways. And almost none of them are remembered. No monuments, no memorials, just forgotten graves in the mountains and stories that were too grim to pass down. Let's be very clear about something. You do not want to live in early California. You think you do, maybe. You imagine adventure and freedom and the thrill of the frontier. You're wrong. If you were transported back to 1850s California right now, you'd be dead within a month, probably less. You wouldn't survive the water. You wouldn't survive the food. You wouldn't survive the labor. You wouldn't survive the violence. Today, if you're thirsty in California, you turn on a tap. The water is clean, filtered, tested, and safe. In early California, every drink of water was a gamble. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery, death from diarrhea was common. Today, if you're hungry, you go to a grocery store. Food is abundant, affordable, and safe to eat. In early California, food was scarce, wildly expensive, and often contaminated. People starved surrounded by supply stores they couldn't afford to buy from. Today, if you're sick, you see a doctor. You get antibiotics, you get painkillers, you get surgery with anesthesia in sterile conditions. You survive things that would have killed you instantly in 1850. In early California, a cut on your hand could turn septic and kill you. Appendicitis was a death sentence. Pneumonia was a death sentence. Childbirth was a death sentence. Today, if you're hurt on the job, there are safety regulations, workers' compensation, and legal protections. In early California, if you were injured at work, you were fired and left to die. No compensation, no medical care, nothing. Today, if you're the victim of a crime, you call the police. There are investigators, lawyers, and a justice system. In early California, there was no one to call. Justice was whatever you could enforce yourself, and most people couldn't enforce anything. Today, women have rights. They can own property, vote, work, leave abusive situations, and expect legal protection. In early California, women were property themselves in many ways. They had almost no rights and almost no options. Today, children go to school. They're protected by labor laws. They're not expected to work 16-hour days in dangerous conditions. In early California, children were worked to death regularly, and no one thought twice about it. Today, immigrants, despite ongoing challenges, have legal protections and pathways to citizenship. In early California, immigrants were exploited, terrorized, and murdered with the state's blessing. The gap between then and now isn't just about technology or convenience. It's about fundamental human dignity and the value of human life. In early California, most lives were considered disposable. Today, at least in theory, every life matters. You live in an era of unprecedented safety, health, and opportunity. The fact that you can read this, that you have time to watch videos, that you're not working yourself to death just to survive, that's not normal in human history. That's extraordinary. That's a gift. And it was purchased with the suffering of the people who came before you, the people who died building California, the people whose names we don't know and whose graves we can't find. Don't take it for granted. Early California wasn't a dream. It was a brutal, unforgiving place that chewed up human lives and spit out bones. Everything you've seen in this video, the starvation, the disease, the violence, the exploitation, that was normal life. That was just what daily existence looked like for hundreds of thousands of people who came to California hoping for something better. Most of them didn't find it. Most of them found suffering and death instead. The California dream is real now, but it wasn't real then. It was built slowly over decades by people who survived conditions that would break most of us within days. They didn't build it through optimism or pioneering spirit. They built it through desperation, sacrifice, and unimaginable hardship. When you think about early California, don't think about gold and adventure. Think about the freezing miners who died face down in rivers. Think about the women who had no choices. Think about the children who never got to be children. Think about the immigrants who were killed just for existing. They deserve to be remembered, not romanticized. Remembered for what they actually endured. And you deserve to understand how lucky you are to live in the world they built. The world where clean water comes from taps, where food is abundant, where medicine exists, where safety is expected, and where human life has value. Early California was survival, not dreams, survival, and most people didn't make it. If this opened your eyes to what life was really like in early America, watch the other state documentaries on this channel. Every state has a history like this. Every state was built on suffering that we've forgotten. Don't forget it. Remember what it took. Remember what they went through. And be grateful you live now instead of then. Because if you had to live through what they lived through, you wouldn't make it. None of us would.